All right. Hello, everybody, and thank you so much for joining us. It's really exciting to host this actually final panel of the ASBX 2021 this year. And with the time difference to Australia, everybody there is obviously sleeping. But rest assured, we're recording this session and people will be able to watch this later on the YouTube channel. Thank you all for joining, and as per introduction, just briefly about me, I'm Chris Maynard. I'm an assistant professor of biomedical engineering at Mayo Clinic in Jacksonville, Florida. And my background is in medicine and biochemistry and biology, so not so much on space ethics and space law, but I'm looking forward to talking to an incredible panel today and to really dive into the discussion of ethics and what lays ahead for space law as well. With that, brief housekeeping, as per usual, we'll ask everybody who's not speaking to mute their mic. People in the audience, please feel free to write questions in the chat, and we will either directly answer them in our discussion and bring them up, or the panelists are also welcome to answer in the chat. With that, and without further delay, I am going to introduce our panelists today, and it's my great pleasure to introduce Allison Decker, who's a JD and General Counsel, litigator, and mediator, a business leader, and has great focus on space law. And I will give you the floor now to introduce yourself and tell us more about your work and your expertise in space law itself.
Well, hi everyone, I'm Allison Claire Decker, and I'm a practicing attorney in California and owner of Allison Claire Law. I graduated from the University of Southern California Law School in 2007, and before founding Allison Claire Law in 2021, my practice had taken me from an Am Law 100 firm to several nationally renowned boutique law firms to being Vice President of Legal Affairs, aka General Counsel, for a group of privately held companies with an annual revenue of over $100 million. I now work with startups and businesses of all sizes, including aerospace companies, as a fractional general counsel. And I'm on the advisory board for Smoky Hawk Solitons, an aerospace propulsion group. I'm also a legal advisor to Just Ad Astra, an international organization focused on bringing human rights to the stars. I'm here today to talk about the intersection of space law and employment law. And that's an area that I am particularly interested in as we start seeing more private civilians traveling and working in space, and as space exploration becomes more and more commercialized. Earlier this week, my presentation for ASBX entitled Employment Relationships and Privacy in Space was published on their YouTube channel. And I want to give you a little taster of some of the things I discuss in that presentation. So first off, there's a clear internationally recognized legal right to privacy in Article 17 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And this includes protections against arbitrary or unlawful interference with one's privacy, family, home, or correspondence. And there's also an internationally recognized right to health, which you can see in the International Covenant on Economic, Social, and Cultural Rights at Article 12. And these two rights have been read together to create a right to privacy as to one's health and medical information. Now, in America, the right to privacy is based on a combination of constitutional and common law theories. And some states, including California, have specific state constitutional protections guaranteeing the right to privacy. In addition, we have HIPAA, the Health Insurance Portability and Accountability Act, which, although horribly misunderstood by the general public and politicians alike, does contain privacy protections that are designed to limit the use and disclosure of protected health information and ensure the confidentiality of medical communications. In addition to these general privacy protections, there are also specific employee privacy protections. On the international level, we have the International Convention on the Protection of the Rights of All Migrant Workers and Members of Their Families, which states in Article 14 that no migrant worker or member of his or her family shall be subjected to arbitrary or unlawful interference with his or her privacy, family, correspondence, or other communication. Now, none of the major spacefaring nations have signed on to the Migrant Worker Convention, but employees in America enjoy many privacy protections. And while those vary from state to state, The overriding themes include protections from employers intercepting private communications and keeping personal information and especially health information confidential. But in space, many of these normal privacy rights that we enjoy and expect, including the right to privacy within our homes and our personal lives, the ability to engage in private communications, the ability to keep our personal health information confidential, and our ability to limit an employer's intrusion into our private lives are incredibly easy to exploit and ignore. And this is because the space environments that we currently live in and work in have to be constantly monitored. Those living and working in space also have to be closely monitored. The close quarters within current space habitats can lead to a lack of private space. Communications can be easily intercepted and monitored, and access to communication systems can be completely denied. So to make sure that we preserve the rights to privacy that we currently enjoy on Earth, as humans begin to truly live and work in space, I would propose that we set clear standards, including limiting the monitoring and collection of personal and health data to only what is absolutely necessary to ensure minimum health guidelines, create individual and shared private spaces in all space habitats, develop a space HIPAA, so to speak, that would strictly control the distribution of medical and other personal information, and that we ensure that there is unmonitored access to private communication systems. And with that, I just want to say that it is a pleasure to be here, and thank you, Chris, for moderating this important panel.
Thank you, and thank you for these insights and actually, the written components to this. I think, this is really going to be an essential part of our discussion. What are we basing, our discussion on? So thank you so much for putting that together and joining us today. It's really great. It's also really my great honor to introduce Dr. AJ Link. He is an aerospace and space law expert and accessibility consultant and disability advocate, and also the director of the Task Force on Inclusion, Diversity, and Equity in Aerospace at the Center for Air and Space Law. And I'm sure I've forgotten 15 other things that you're involved in. I'm super excited to have you on the panel. Please take the stage and introduce yourself and share some more about your work. And I know that you and Allison, we learned this earlier, have a lot in common and a lot of work overlap. So I'm happy to hear more.
Yeah, hey y'all, this is AJ speaking. I use he, him pronouns. I've got a black hat on and a black shirt. I'm a black dude with a beard. I'm based in DC, which is stolen land from the Piscataway and Anacostan people. Yeah, you don't have to call me doctor. I do have a JD, but I'm just AJ. I'm real chill about it. I do focus on space ethics, potential space governance, and overall human rights in space. And I think Allison's recap was so amazing, and mine won't be that incredible or that prepared. But I think it's really important that we discuss and think about and contemplate how we're creating these new systems in space and whether or not we want them to mirror or replicate the current systems we have in space, whether that's to do with privacy rights or health rights and health protections, or whether that has to do with cultural rights and the right to self-determination, self-governance. I think that space provides an opportunity for not nearly a blank canvas, but a canvas that provides the opportunity for us to create all different types of societies, right? Like something that I've heard a lot in the space community, that space is big enough for everyone, which it should be. And, we talk about the right to access, but that allows for the difference of humanity, and we should respect that, right? Not everyone wants to live the same type of way. And I think Allison did a good job of talking about kind of the minimum protections that everyone should have, but we should also think about kind of the freedoms of opportunity for folks to create their own kinds of societies. And I'm just incredibly happy to be here. Thank you so much for inviting me. And I'm really interested in the conversation and discussions what we're going to have. I'm really excited for Toby's introduction. Hopefully it's more fantastic than mine.
Oh, I mean, I think thank you so much for joining. This is very great. And I already have 20 notes going down here where I want to dive in a second. But to complete our panels of doctors, shall I say, it is my great pleasure to also introduce Dr. Toby Cameron, who is a physician and specializes in trauma and acute care, critical care at Bay State Health. He's the former president of the Space Surgery Association And he has, and I encourage everybody to watch that as well, a very thought-provoking approach to ethics and potentially what it means to be in space and experience either a health emergency, or what should we do maybe on a more prophylactic approach and in terms of keeping astronauts or future space travelers healthy. Toby, please take the stage and introduce yourself and share some of your thoughts.
Thanks. I don't think that was a much more impressive introduction than I probably deserve. I'm a trauma and critical care doc or surgeon at Bay State in Springfield, Mass. I deal with ethical issues on a daily basis in the ICU, and from a surgical standpoint and a research standpoint, my big interest is in how to provide surgical care in space. And the funny thing about that is that every time we talk about this, we come up against this Jeff Goldblum moment of just because we can do something, should we do it? And surgery in space is a very good example of that, because the truth is, can we do it? Probably. Should we do it? Unclear. And unclear for many reasons. And one of my talk earlier this week was on prophylactic splenectomy, which is hopefully something that nobody's ever going to think about again after seeing my talk, even though some people have been thinking about it before seeing that talk. But it's a surgery takes up a lot of resources, and the truth is that many times those resources, especially in a long duration space flight, are probably better spent on the astronauts who are not injured and don't require operation. That may be different in the setting of someone who's on the space station or on the moon, which I'm really excited to talk about, and the ethical issues of providing medical care in space, especially when you have if someone has a medical or surgical issue on a flight to Mars and that person uses up all of the suture on the spacecraft or all of the IV fluid on the spacecraft, and then someone else needs it for vomiting a month later, you're really in trouble. So that's kind of where I'm coming from, and I think it's actually really exciting, and I'm really excited to be on this panel with two people who are more impressive than me and have thought about this a lot more than I have probably.
Well, clearly everybody is extremely humble, but I get to dictate and tell everybody how I'm truly honored. So let's jump right into this. I actually want to start with Allison. So you mentioned, yes, we need laws to govern and laws to decide, what is private, what is public, what is there that we can, ensure in terms of protection. How do you envision, I mean, we all live in today's world, and politics is real, and different countries have different approaches. We have a ton of new and emerging space agencies across the world. How would you envision, if you could just close your eyes and pick it, how we're going to create these laws and bring everybody on to the table? Because it's not going to be just one country, and it is not going to be just the US or just Europe. So what are your thoughts?
And I think that's a really good question, because right now our international space law is really focused on state actors and not on commercial actors or business entities or private citizens in space, whereas the laws don't really sort of cover that. And we're also seeing that there's been less ability within the international community for countries to agree on new space laws or space regulations or rules. Most of what we follow is from way back in the 1970s, and there hasn't really been anything new that's a concrete new law on space issues. So I think to a certain extent, we may end up with something that is something sort of akin to our current maritime system in a way back on Earth, where depending on either what country has launched the space object, or if the space object is registered to another country, whoever sort of controls that will control the jurisdiction. So I think a lot of the rules we have are still going to be state-based and not an overriding international rule, because I do think it is going to be very hard to reach agreement on sort of these general minimum guidelines when we can't reach agreements really on anything else right now, it seems like. So, it's sort of like we may end up sort of in a situation where it is still state by state, and private companies will end up choosing to a certain extent what states they want to fall under the jurisdiction and the rules of.
Anybody else have any thoughts on that specifically? otherwise, I'm going to call out you, AJ. So you brought up an interesting thing, actually. So the way I think about, especially, the near future space exploration is like, okay, this is organized either by private companies or by individual governments, as Allison just mentioned. And, there's going to be a space station, there's going to be a habitat on the moon, or, the lunar gateway. But you mentioned, not everybody who's going to go into space wants to live the same way. And I think that's a really, really interesting aspect. And it's actually, I think, one that I actually haven't thought about, because it seems to me right now, it's like, well, if you decide to go, you're kind of under the umbrella of whoever's sending you, and you don't have any other rights, right? So what are your thoughts on that? How do you think, especially in the near term, not like 100 years from now when, we're just populated everywhere, but in the near term, what are your thoughts on how this could even work?
Yeah, I think that question's really complicated, and we want to create protections for those folks who are maybe going with private companies or on state missions as astronauts. We don't want things like East India companies, right, or company towns, or people kind of doing whatever they want. There are protections in space, but are there enough, right? And when we create those, when we think about what it is long term, are we creating laws that are malleable to what happens in the future? I think we need to expand what we believe humans in space looks like. There was a comment earlier about mental health in space, and it's a quote unquote huge issue, but I think we need the wide variety and spectrum of neurodivergence in space, right? Sometimes introverts are better for long-term missions in space than extroverts because there's less interaction with people. You need people who are okay with isolation, right? When you think about people who maybe have anxiety or depression, we need to understand how being in space affects those people, right? I'm not a scientist, I won't claim to be, but is it one of those things where being in space and being able to see, Earth and having the overview effect helps folks with anxiety? Maybe it does, maybe it doesn't. Maybe being in a really small container does a lot for someone's anxiety that's negative, right? I think we need to know all these things, because if we truly want to expand into the stars, like you're saying, long term, we need to know how it affects everyone in space, right? And that includes folks with disabilities, that includes, folks who we generally don't see in space, whether that's non-binary and trans folks. And I'm sure Toby can talk about this. Like the way that, the human body is affected medically changes with every body, right? Like every single individual body. And, space is going to be the exact same, right? We don't know what space is going to look like when it affects different kinds of human bodies and different kinds of human conditions. So when you talk about what the near term looks like, I think we need to make space as accessible as possible for as many people as possible, and for the people who want to go, right? I think we also need to acknowledge that not everyone is going to want to go to space, right? Not everyone views space as a refuge or an adventure. Some people are terrified and never want to leave the Earth. Some people have cultural ties to this planet that they don't want to leave, right? They have, centuries and centuries of family roots that are on this planet, and we have to respect that. I think, again, we have to kind of expand how we view what space can be and what space exploration is, and create systems that are, one, really adaptable to the situations that are potential, right? We can't see that far into the future, but at least having an open mind about the types of systems we're building to make sure they're malleable. But two, making sure that those systems are accessible for the folks who want to go, whether that's changing our standards for who can go to space, whether that's higher investment in space so that the cost of going to space is a lot less than it is now, so you don't have only rich and privileged folks going to space. But then, on the flip side, and something Allison works at, when you're sending people to work in space, right, making sure that it's not the poorest of the poor and the most marginalized, and if it is that group of people, that we have enough protections that they're not dying like we see with a lot of migrant workers who do a lot of dangerous jobs here on Earth.
AJ, actually, I wanted to second that. I think, one of the nice things, and granted, about the new commercial space flight, especially in the last couple months, is we've seen from a medical standpoint, and not that I think that this is such an awesome thing, but William Shatner is 90 years old and went into space. And that's, awesome for anybody who's a Star Trek fan, but also until, a month ago, nobody would have ever thought to send a 90-year-old into space. right? Everyone thought this is a horrible idea. And I jokingly talk about, as a trauma surgeon, that I jokingly say that one of the biggest problems we have in the trauma department is excessive gravity, because most of our patients are here because they fell. But I mean, it's so joking. It's entirely possible that opening up a nursing home in space is not a terrible idea. Like, maybe they would do well if they have, probably not, but who knows? So I agree. I think that we need to definitely open up, as you say, the view of what it means to be in, who can be in space, over just test pilots.
Toby, I actually never thought about nursing home in space. And I'm not saying that we should or shouldn't. I'm saying we should expand what the possibilities and what our thought process are. Maybe some types of physical therapy and rehabilitation work better in space, with the lack of gravity, things like that. When you think about, kind of pool therapy or aquatic therapy or whatever, like these are all questions that are unanswered. And I wish more people would kind of expand their mind, not to get too sci-fi, but to be present, but at least expand their mind to what the possibility is for these things.
I obviously can only agree, and it actually segues us really nicely into my next question, pretty much to everybody. And Allison, feel free to maybe start on that, because everybody has now touched on, the privacy of the travelers, if you will. So from a scientific standpoint, whether that's Toby as a physician or as a biologist, like, we are interested in having as much data as possible, right? If we could, we would put a needle into every muscle and into every whatever you can imagine, and put sensors and gauges on everything of every person that's flying, to get as much as possible information from the currently in the astronaut corps, not so diverse, but at least what's emerging now in the on the private citizen side, quite diverse population. So how do we bring that together? Because we need, as AJ just mentioned, we need to have the data to know what's good for people and how we can prepare them if they wanted to go, right? This is obviously not mandatory, but how do we bring that together with also, the quite, logical question of, okay, where's the limit? How do we limit this? And how do we not come into this trap where we kind of, make people feel like they have to do it, or, what's the in-between road?
And I think that's the problem, is finding that in-between balance, because there definitely is going to be a very different power dynamic between employers and employees in space, because basically you're handing over your life to your employer. They're going to be responsible for giving you oxygen, food, water, all these things we kind of take for granted on Earth. Especially from private employers, they're going to have to provide it to us. So I do think it is very easy for that to be exploited, and to come into a situation where you feel like you are forced to give a lot of information, or forced to give up a lot of your rights because you don't have any control in that situation. And I do think there's a big difference between our current sort of how we view astronauts, who are basically government employees in the military, frequently, or in some form of the armed forces, and they do give up a lot of their rights as sort of part of that. It's sort of par for the course, and in exchange they also get benefits for life, basically for healthcare too. So it is kind of a balance there that they're taken care of when they also return to Earth. And I don't think we're going to see that balance as well for private civilians going into space or working in space. I do understand the importance of having to monitor and gather this information. I'm not saying that we shouldn't be doing that, but I think there has to be limits on it, because otherwise you're giving up so much for so little in return in some of these situations. So I think that we do need to find a balance, monitoring during dangerous things, or doing weekly check-ins, or to check vitals and things like that. I think those things are important, but at the same time, I think you also need to allow people to have that private space. We're not used to having our employers monitoring every single part of our lives. So, monitoring when we eat, when we go to the bathroom, when we sleep, what we eat. We're not used to that. And I don't think you should have to give that up solely because you are now in a different environment, because those were hard-fought rights on Earth, and they should be preserved, especially if we are looking to create a sustainable future in space. If we want people to live in space and to work in space and to go and live on Mars, they're not going to do that if we are creating an atmosphere where they're not treated with the rights that they are used to on Earth. So we do have to find that balance between gathering data, but doing it in a way that is not overly intrusive or unnecessarily intrusive, and also that we're not sharing this data in a way that sort of is providing it to the, like, I know that sounds weird, but not, you know, the same way we have our medical data now, like you can have studies that hide the individual's information. So we know like side effects or things like that, but we're not going to know that was so-and-so who felt that way or who felt sick. And there's a good example of that on the Inspiration4 documentary, which is sort of the first big civilian mission to space, where there was some issues with crew members getting sick and nauseous sort of from the space travel, and they were careful to not disclose who that was or show any videos or information about it. So I think there are ways to monitor without pushing out that information or losing our privacy rights.
Allison, I would actually argue that we don't need to monitor that much. I mean, I think that we need to have, certainly if someone's nauseous and vomiting, we need to be able to, you know, give them nausea medications, but that's the same thing that happens if you get nauseous on a flight, you know, from here to Australia, right? There's a flight attendant who gives you an anti-nausea medications. So I'm not sure that we actually need, I mean, I think that, so on the Inspiration4 missions, it's a little different because there was a research protocol from the Inspiration4 mission that went through, I think Baylor is the one who did it, but and so they collected a lot of data, but the 4 people on that mission actually consented to the data being collected. And it went through an IRB, and you know, any research we get here has to go through an IRB or an institutional review board. And that's actually, I will say, from being at multiple different institutions, it's extremely variable what the institutional review boards are like. And some institutions are much easier to get through than others. And so I think that there needs to be some kind of, I agree, some kind of review, at least if you're trying to collect research data in space, because, and the truth is we probably don't need to collect that much.
I don't know if I'm in the middle or merging the two, but I think that we need to be collecting as much as possible in order to provide and create safe space environments. But I do think it should be optional, right? I guess this is me pushing that we need as many people in space as possible, right? It's just like, you know, we're talking about scientific trials here and internal review boards here. A lot of those tests, all of them are voluntary, right? It's not like a Tuskegee incident here in the US, but folks will probably want to volunteer their data, right? If you think about the current pandemic and how awful that is, some parents were willing to have their kids go through the trials to see if vaccines were okay for children, right? And some were vehemently against and are still against the vaccine, right? We have a diversity of human experience and human preference. And I think we need to get that into space, right? We need as many people as possible so that we have a broad pool to choose from. So I don't think folks' rights need to be violated. I know someone was talking about menstruation people with periods and things like that. But, you know, we are in a place now where, you know, when someone has a period, they don't need their doctor to monitor it unless it's, you know, kind of abnormal or something that they're not used to, or they're in pain. And it doesn't have to be extreme pain, by the way, right? We need more medical professionals that know that any pain is bad and try to reduce that. But I think getting folks to space, making it accessible and affordable, and creating spaces that are quote unquote safe for however safe space is really important to get this data, right? I think the data is extremely important when we're talking about, you know, how gravity affects folks, whether that's, you know, in a vehicle or it's on the surface of a celestial body, right? The variance of gravity and what the long-term effects are, right? Some people will go up to space. You were talking about William Shatner for a couple minutes or a couple days. Some people will be in space for months, years, decades, right? And that's going to have different effects on our body that we don't know. And we need that kind of long-term data. I'm so sorry, I forget. Longitudinal studies, right? We need longitudinal studies to collect that data to see what the long-term effects are. And this is going to be a long process, right? Like, we will have people in space for hundreds and hundreds of years before we have the data that we need to know those effects, which, you know, we can argue the ethics of that and whether it's good or bad, but some people want to go and don't care. Like someone like me, I would go to Mars on a one-way trip and I would be studied endlessly and would give up all my privacy, but that's who I am, right? Not everyone is like that. And I'm happy that not everyone's like that, because we need, you know, the difference of thought, opinion, and experience.
Perfectly agree, and really well put. I think a real big challenge is also how do you reduce, so, you know, if we're advocating for choice, right? How much do I want to share? Which of the studies or parts of the study do I want to partake? How do we reduce the peer pressure, right? I would assume that on Inspiration 4, because everybody was enrolled in the same IRB, right? Which means, you know, the same study protocol, they probably consented all to everything, and likely, you know, I mean, hopefully because everybody felt like this is what I'm doing, and I'm doing this for, you know, also the collection of data. But I'm assuming it's also hard to be the only one out of a very close team to say, no, I don't really want to share this part. So I think that level of protection for an individual also then needs to be given, that, you know, you have the chance to really maybe pick and choose, right? Again, from a scientific perspective, it, you know, breaks my heart if certain data is not collected, but I do appreciate that, you know, right to privacy and self, you know, governance is really important. One thing that was brought up earlier in the week is also that even today, some astronauts are not really, you know, excited about having a lot of monitoring when they're even just on the ISS, because there's this chance that something pops up in the in that data that may prevent them from future missions. So I mean, it's also, you know, how people are planning their life and planning to spend their life. So I'm going to segue into the next section here, which is a little bit provocative, and I'm going to start off with Toby on this one, because it's starting off with his talk, but actually he's taking us even further, and what he also already mentioned in the introduction. And I want to kind of frame this as you know, the ethics of long-term missions, if we will, anything that's beyond LEO, where we can't just turn around in pretty much 90 minutes and come back. What is it, how to approach it? Is it for the good of the one or the good of the many if something goes wrong? And how should we approach this?
So with apologies to William Shatner, I do take the Spock approach to this, which is that the good of the many outweigh the good of the few, or the one. And I think that it's important, right? I think that if you send 4 people to Mars, or hopefully 7 people to Mars, depending on how it goes, and you cannot have one of those 7 people use up all the medical resources of the crew. On the other hand, you also don't want to let one person die, because that increases the work of the other 6 people in the crew. So it's just from that standpoint, it's a balancing act, right? And not to be like too mercenary about it, but if someone dies on day 2 of the mission, then that's a significant increased workload that you've now added to everybody else. On the other hand, if someone uses up all the medical supplies on day 2 of the mission, you've now just ruined everybody else's ability to have, you know, issues later on. And this segues into all this research on prophylactic surgery, which is, there's actually been a fair amount on, and mostly for appendectomy and cholecystectomy, you know, removing of appendix and gallbladder, because of the concern that someone will get appendicitis or have, you know, gallbladder problems 2 months or 6 months, whatever, into a 7-year mission, and not be able to fix it. And the data has actually been pretty clear for that the risks of taking those organs out far outweighs the benefit of taking them out for the mission. And the reason why I like the spleen talk, and I mentioned this in my talk, is that the gallbladder and the appendix data is actually specifically about the mission itself. It's about the risk to the mission of your appendix, because we don't take your appendix out because you might have a problem later on the line. We would take it out specifically because of mission risk. And the splenectomy stuff is actually about risk to the person, which I think is actually a whole different topic of what's the risk to someone to going into space, and the radiation is one of these big risks. And so the risk is not that you're going to get cancer from your spleen being in at some point on the mission and ruin the mission. It's the risk is that you'll have cancer somewhere down the line, and that's I think actually makes it a much easier decision, because you're not putting the mission at risk. And so there should be a much higher threshold to do something that's not going to put the mission at risk in that particular account, in that particular setting, because the taking a risk of taking someone's spleen out when the complications of that operation could put the mission at risk, whereas the benefit of the operation has no effect on the mission, it's a much easier decision for me than something like an appendix, where the benefits of taking the appendix out remove risk to the mission, and the risk of really increase risk to the mission, which I realize I've talked in circles a little bit, but my point is mostly that I think it's a really difficult question of what do you do with this limited resources, and someone mentioned that this has been a problem for the Army and the military for a while, and the truth is it hasn't really been for like 400 years, because sure, and in the 1600s, when they were, sitting on these 3-month trips around the, year-long trips around the world, they had a limited resources. But even then, the resources were not as limited as we think, because they could go to land somewhere and get more resources. The type of resource limitation we're talking about for a long duration spaceflight is unheard of in terms of the human experience. And I think that we really have to take a sharp look at whether or not it's worth certain things from an ethical standpoint. And I don't know the answer. But we have these issues in the ICU, especially with COVID recently, where we've had issues where, we have, so for instance, ECMO, which is putting people on a heart-lung machine for COVID. There's only a limited number of ECMO machines in the hospital. And when you've used them all up for COVID patients and someone needs one, you have to have a real question about whether or not you take someone off and let them die so that you can use that machine for somebody else who might live. Unfortunately, we haven't had that problem here, but it's been happening elsewhere in the country. So yeah, I don't know that I actually added anything to this conversation, but I think that to summarize, it's a very important ethical decision, and I don't know what the answer is.
I think for me, to answer your question, the ethical decision isn't going to be in our hands, right? We can have all these concerns and protocols, but it's going to be up to the people on the ship, right? Or the folks who are living on the celestial body. And I think not to be too libertarian and laissez-faire about it, but I think we should allow folks the opportunity to make those choices. We are sending adults, I would assume, unless labor laws and other child protections change, into space, and they should be able to make that decision. So in Toby's example, if the other 6 passengers decide it's worth the risk to try to do the surgery and use up the medical supplies, there's not going to be a ton of folks that can stop them, right? When they're, hundreds of thousands of miles away. If they make that decision collectively, that's the decision they make. We can argue about whether or not it was the right decision, wrong decision, or best decision. But if they make that decision, that's on them. And again, not to just harbor back to this point, that's why we need to be sending up lots of people. Every crew is going to make a different decision, right? Every crew is going to weigh the pros and cons differently, because that's just how human beings are. We can, say that we all are logical beings and that we'll all come to the same logical conclusion, but that's just not how it's going to be, unfortunately. And I think there is no right answer, and the right answer is to empower people to make those decisions because they'll have to.
AJ, I would love to do a sociology study with you about that and put people on a Mars analog mission and give them and tell them on day 2 of their six-month mission, congratulations, someone has appendicitis, what are you going to do? And then if they use it with medical resources, then not let them use their medical resources for the rest of the 6 months and see what happens.
Yeah, I'm down to write that proposal. I'm not a great scientist, but definitely we can send that somewhere and get the funding.
I think it's really interesting to think about how, that really also means that every crew, I think if I say crew, I often think of, highly trained astronauts, but going forward, there are going to be workers, there are going to be, people that are, on a celestial body for a purpose and not just for explorations and seeing how things are going, right? So are we going to be able to always have people there that want to make that decision? I think that's another really important point, because you have to really live with that, right? Just like many physicians have, and I think it's a tough one. But Allison, sorry, you also had a comment.
No, I think I'm just a little bit less optimistic than AJ that people will make good decisions, or that people won't abuse that kind of decision or power making. Like maybe the decision will be different if they don't like that crew member, or if they do like them. And I think that's a big concern too, in that we're creating these sort of bizarre dynamics that don't exist back on Earth, where you don't have to hope that your coworkers really like you enough, or that they're not using this as an excuse to mutiny or get rid of you. So I think there has to be some sort of guidelines or rules with the hope that people will follow them. Obviously, it's hard, because how do you enforce something when they're millions of miles away, or they're not coming back for 3 years? You can't really, unless you figure out some enforcement mechanisms, which we haven't figured out yet. And I think one of the concerns I have, also just coming from sort of the employee HR background, because I do a lot of that work, is that these decisions shouldn't be ones that are left up to your employers or your coworkers. that they decide, you know, if your life is worthwhile. Is this more cost benefit? Because if we start going down that road, you know, it's like, okay, well, maybe it's too expensive to feed you well, or maybe it's too expensive to provide you with enough oxygen or enough space. And I think those are the concerns that we might end up in this weird slippery slope. Or you end up in a situation where you don't feel that you're safe or able to complain about unsafe conditions because you're worried that somebody's going to make that decision later to basically take it out on you or punish you or remove those few rights and access that you have. So I think that's sort of a concern to me if we just sort of let each mission sort of operate as their own little society. I don't necessarily see that turning into a good thing.
I think I would agree, and I think I really liked your point, like, you know, because it will really depend on the group dynamic, right? And that can be that somebody is disliked or, you know, not in favor, but it also can be exactly the other way around, that somebody is highly in favor of a few crew members, and now all resources, you know, are used up, Toby, and then nothing is left for everybody else, which may also be, you know, in this case, maybe the wrong decision, if you will, for the long term of the mission. So yeah, it's obviously a big question. That's why we're discussing it. And I'm going to add another even bigger one to that, and want to kind of get everybody's thought on the following scenario, which becomes a little bit darker even, and that is, not just somebody is sick and can be helped with resources or likely be helped, but what if somebody gets sick and cannot be helped, but is still alive, but it is completely clear that there's no rescue, there's no surgical procedure or medical procedure that can be done, and they can't come back in time, but shutting off systems early would allow to preserve valuable resources. Is that different, or is that the same as what we were just discussing as somebody who is more acutely sick?
So just to weigh in on that, I think, you know, the truth of the matter is that, you know, Sarah just said euthanasia, and I think that that's actually honestly the truth. And we had a discussion. I have patients in my ICU right now who are 99% likely to die, but we keep doing everything we can because family wants it, patient wants it. You know, we do it, and that's maybe the right choice, maybe not choice. That's a long, complicated ethical discussion that obviously we're not going to have it here. But the truth is, if you're talking about, in addition to the person who's sick, you're, especially with on a long duration space flight, if you have one person who has something that makes them dying, and it's going to take them a week to die or 2 days to die, it's not just tying up that person. You're tying up at least one more crew member to take care of that person, right? And that's 24 hours a day they need care probably until they do die. So you're really tying up one crew member every shift. So you're tying up you may be tying up a half your crew or a third of your crew to take care of somebody who's going to die. And that's a huge decision, and probably is not okay from a limited resource standpoint in a long duration space flight.
Yeah, I think this conversation gets to something that Alice and I talk about and work on, and that's the right to life versus the right to health, and how that plays in and what the quality of life is, and the threshold of protection, right? So I agree with Allison that it could be dangerous to allow crews to just choose on a limb who gets to live and who gets to die. I think that's extremely dangerous, and I want to make that clear. And we should be creating those minimum thresholds, but at some point you don't have the resources, the human power, the technology to keep folks alive. And I think what we should be doing, and obviously these things will probably happen, we have to acknowledge that, is creating environments where we do our best to limit those types of incidents, or providing spaces where if those things were to occur, people have the best of options, if that's even a real thing in kind of those harsh situations, right? They have the ability to make informed decisions that are humane in practice.
I would also just add that I think sometimes these decisions are going to need to be made by people outside of the situation, because just imagining that for a crew, the mental stress that's going to be put on them to make this decision, it may be easier if there are guidelines, or the decision, you know, comes from the mission control back on Earth or something else, being like, okay, we've gone through the checklist. This is what it says. We're asking you to follow up these orders or these rules. just to alleviate sort of that kind of development of somebody dealing with that for the rest of the journey or the rest of their time together, that I had to make this decision versus I had to follow this rule. And it's not, it may not make a humongous difference, but I think it would for the long-term mental health impact of a crew.
I think I would totally agree. So essentially, very similar to what exists on Earth, right? Kind of this, like, you know, not just a general crew protocol, but also that every person itself has, you know, kind of puts down their own wishes and ways that, you know, they would like, at least like, if the resources allow, to be treated and, you know, potentially shut off early if that is the best decision to be made. And those things obviously do exist, right? Do not resuscitate is a thing. And those things do exist on Earth right now, and probably will need to be expanded extensively for spaceflight, but maybe it's a good starting point. I had another a little bit of a shift and kind of bringing us back a little bit to the beginning, again looking at Allison first here on this one and then at everybody else. So there is going to be a lot of private companies that are going to be doing this because there's a lot of money in space and a lot of promise of a market. In terms of rights, in terms of laws, can we trust them? Is it feasible to actually trust them, or do we need, you know, a hopefully international governmental oversight committee in some shape or form that, you know, really is there for the benefit of the people, because most, you know, companies don't actually have, you know, the luxury to put them first, if you will.
So I think there are different communities within the commercial space exploration side of things, where there are some people who really look at this as an opportunity to make things better than on Earth, to improve things, to sort of fix problems that we have and create a more equitable, a more diverse, a more inclusive society. And then I think there are others who really are just looking at this as a way to create value and capital and continue perhaps exploitative practices that currently exist or are not put it, you know, sort of a way to escape the rules and bounds and laws that we have. And I think because there is sort of that dynamic, and because it is very gray right now, like right now, we don't even know what labor laws are going to apply to someone who goes into space. We don't know, you know, what countries' laws are going to apply. There's no international sort of labor laws that a lot of places have signed on to. So there is no sort of basic groundwork yet. And I do think it's important that we do create rules. We've seen how exploitative companies can be without basic rules in states. You know, we've had to enforce laws for minimum wage, for reasonable work days and work hours and work weeks, for child labor laws. We've had to create all these laws to create these rights that we now think of as just normal and part of our work life. So I do think we need to set up these rules for space, and they are going to be different than what we have down here. We're eventually going to get out into space where we're not having the same day cycle that we have here, or the same week cycle, or the same year cycle. So how do we make that work? Do we just assume 40 hours is how we work? Is everyone on call all the time? Like, do you get time off? Like, we don't even know how any of these things are going to work because no one sort of sat down and thought through that process. But I do think at this point, at least, states can enforce basic rules or require companies to come up with some sort of rules that are then communicated clearly and in advance to anyone who's going to go into space. And that's basically because states can right now control who's able to launch. So they can use that power to keep companies from launching who aren't going to have some sort of guidelines that make sense, that do protect employees. And it's not just also on the employee side of things. We also need to have protections with regard to launching things that are going to create lots of debris, or taking up all the orbital space, or polluting or destroying environments in space. Those are all issues that states can still control now by limiting who can launch. And until we have some sort of universal, better thought out universal rules on really what you can do and how we can use these resources, that's the best way to sort of keep things in check.
Yeah, no, I wholeheartedly agree. Toby, go ahead. Go ahead.
I was just going to say you should work on labor laws for medical residents, because I would love a 40-hour work week.
AJ, do you have any thoughts on that, on private companies' approaches and maybe regulations to some extent?
I guess this is a part of space exploration where I'm very vehemently for positivist legal regimes. And Allison was kind of talking about states still having that power until it evaporates in a couple of decades, because I think it will. But we should be restricting who goes to space in terms of private companies until they show that they are committed to providing safe, accessible environments for those who are going up. Even though we know that that's not entirely possible, because space is a hazardous environment and things will happen, we need these companies to show before they get their licensing agreements and their launching privileges that they are committed to at least going as far as possible in terms of providing protections. Because Toby and Allison both said that once they launch, there's no real enforcement, which is a huge gap in terms of the space law regime right now. I mean, you can do state action now, but once people are gone and not coming back, you can't send space cops yet. You can't send the space UN peacekeepers or whatever. So you need to make sure that before they launch, these private companies are as committed as possible to providing, health protections, working protections, things like that. And you can make them put that in their proposals.
AJ, to talk about it, I think that while space is state actors in tourism, it's probably pretty easy to do that. But to Babita's point here is once companies can make money in space, and sending people to space is not about making money off the people, but about using the people to make money in space, it's gonna be a lot harder to enforce those things. Because then you have like Allison mentioned earlier, like in Dubai, where we have these companies in Dubai that are just bringing in migrant workers from South Asia, and they pay them nothing, and they work them essentially to death. And that's what's going to happen in space when someone realizes they can actually make money by mining helium-3 on the moon or whatever it is.
Yeah, I think I actually agree with kind of the VC community that it'll be robots at first, just to test out, what's safe and what isn't. But I do think eventually workers will go up. But I return to state responsibility, right? These companies are still be earthbound when they're doing this, right? They could still face ramifications here on Earth. When we're talking, thousands of years in the future where the companies aren't based here on Earth, hopefully we'll have different types of protections then. But as of right now, those companies will still be based on Earth and can still face consequences here on Earth. So it may take months, maybe even years, to find out that a company is doing something that's wrong. And I don't have faith in a lot of legal systems, including the US legal system, for those who are following the verdict today. But there is still the possibility of them facing terrestrial consequences, right? There's still the hope that states will do the right thing and hold bad actors accountable. Whether or not they do, that's an open question, but we should at least have systems in place where the possibility to hold those bad actors accountable are there.
And I think, yeah, the key is really going to be how can an international community agree on, similar laws and similar rights. And I think it's interesting because space does seem to be different than what many countries do in their normal lives, if you will. I mean, I think the habitation of the International Space Station over the last 20 years, and especially over the last 15 years, has really shown that countries that are normally not so happy with each other are perfectly fine flying together and sitting very close for a very long time. I think space has the ability to bring us together because of the vision and because of the people it draws that for the exploration want to be part of it. And it does become very different when these mining companies get involved that we all learned of from the sci-fi movies and books. So that's probably quite a bit a different story. And Unfortunately, we probably don't solve this today, but for the last 5 minutes, I actually want to give each of you another brief opportunity, a minute or two, if you had some closing thoughts, some vision, like something that provokes our thoughts that we can take home on ethics or law that we would like to see in the future. Allison, you're always first on my screen. I'm going to point you out again. Please take the floor if you have any additional comments.
Yeah, I think one of the things that's really important right now is to get public involvement and public pressure to make rules and to make this a priority. And even if we aren't able to get an international agreement on these issues, I think that having public pressure on some of these private companies will make a difference. We've seen that being successful in other issues involving, for example, like LGBTQ rights. We've seen public pressure change the way companies are addressing this issue, change how they're doing business. And I think if we can get that same interest within the public space about making space this great opportunity for people to come together, for it to be more diverse, more inclusive, more equitable, we are going to see those changes happen, whether it's through either legislation that's finally pushed through but at the state or international level, or just with companies making private pledges that, no, we're going to be like the good space company and here's our plan, and then others might follow suit. So I think having that public involvement is really important in taking things to the next step for the international space community.
And hopefully social media can be used for good in this way as well, right? To create that public pressure, right? That's really what we're seeing. Thank you. AJ, you're already up.
I was just going to add that part of that public involvement is having an educated public. There's still a huge PR battle to get folks to realize that space isn't just a billionaire's playground. It's not throwing money away. This is an investment in humanity. There's so many different technologies that we have that we use here on Earth that are based from space technologies, and we don't know the extent of what space can provide us as a species, right? But I do think something that I've grown to learn as I've been doing this is, we have to be a lot more realistic about the type of people who eventually end up in space. The diversity of human experience means there's going to be a lot of bad people in space. And we should do the best that we can to protect those who aren't in that group. We should also acknowledge that eventually those kind of bad actors will find each other and, we'll hopefully shoot off millions and millions of miles away from everyone else and have their terrible society. But that we have to, do our best to protect the good actors from the bad actors, because they will eventually be there, right? And we should be preparing for that long term. However you think about space, whether it's a utopia of multiculturalism and equitability, or it's a utopia where you can escape that because you hate the idea of being diverse and inclusive, we have to realize that we're going to be in conflict for the first couple of years, and space is a really harsh place, right? And it will always be harsh. We kind of think of space as going up and coming back down with a suborbital flight. But when you're hundreds of thousands of miles away from any type of firm ground, it's a totally different type of experience, right? When we're thinking about long-term exploration, and we should be preparing for that now, because the decisions we make today are going to affect humanity, thousands of years from now. When someone made the first bow and arrow, they didn't know that would lead to eventually us having guns and being able to, kill people at a whim, right? Like, they didn't think about that because they didn't know. And we don't know those types of things, but we should at least be laying the groundwork with our decisions to say, in the inevitability that, the diversity of decisions happen, we've created this firm foundation for humanity to at least move forward in a decent enough way.
I can only obviously agree, and I think we're maybe still kind of finding ourselves in this little bubble where we just, assume that everybody is doing this for the greater good. But you're right, this will probably very soon subside. And I personally am totally in favor of the bad actor planet. I'm totally good with them having their own place. It can be as far away as possible. So I'm totally gonna steal that one. Toby, you get the last word for the panel today.
I was saying that's very 18th century British. Is let's send all the bad people over to Mars or Australia, which is probably not something to say in the setting, but Russian Siberia. How about that? We'll use that instead. Yeah, I mean, I think that it's important. I agree. I think with my co-panelists here, like, it's really important to come up with these plans beforehand, but also understanding that, like we said, there's no atheists in foxholes. So we can come up with all the plans we want, but the first time someone has an emergency on the way to Mars, every single one of our plans is going to get thrown right out the window, and there's going to be some really difficult decisions that are going to have to be made. And humans, unfortunately, are very bad at deciding things. About weighing, well, in general, but we're also very bad about weighing current risks against future risks. And that's going to be a real problem, I think, going forward, but we'll work on it and we'll, figure something out eventually. Have an overall positive view of the human experience, I think.
Good. I think we should hold on to that, to be fair. But I really appreciate all of your insights. I mean, I know we could probably talk another week about all these different aspects. And it would be great if we could solve some, but it clearly also needs huge involvement from a large crowd. I really appreciate everybody's time today and for joining us, both in our panelists as well as our audience. And again, this panel discussion is recorded and we'll be uploading that shortly to our YouTube channel. If you haven't had a chance already, please go to the YouTube channel and check out the pre-recordings of our speakers. Very interesting and exciting. I'm sure everybody is open for further interaction and emails, etc. So please, everybody, feel free to reach out. Thank you again, everybody, for your time. I learned a lot, and this was truly thought-provoking, and I'm very honored to have met all of you. Thank you.
Thank y'all so much for having me. I really appreciate it.
Thank you so much
Thanks.
for joining.
Thank you for moderating. This was really a great conversation.